Edward Fang. Verse 7. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the land of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. So Exodus 3 begins by molding our understanding of our calling with respect to our job. And I'm going to tie it in with how that relates with how Moses was called in this process. But it's an understanding of our respect to our job, our vocation, or our calling with respect with how we engage the world, our calling with respect to how we are salt and light of the earth, and how we should, as extension of the body of Christ, be an extension of God's hand and the message of Jesus Christ through our various vocations. So, our calling. What is the nature of our calling in this world is the question you guys might have as new grads or vet students. And also, second is, what is the biblical understanding and principle to determine your calling? So I want to share about the nature of our calling in this world. When we think about the calling, the word calling, we think about our various jobs, calling to be a student, calling to be a husband, a father, a wife. Children, we're called to be obedient to our parents. You know, as students, we ought to be diligent in our studies. As veterinarians, obviously responsible for our clients and our jobs. So there's various facets and responsibilities to our calling. So this passage in Exodus 3 that we read with the call of Moses sheds light on how we're supposed to understand our calling. So I want to discuss a biblical understanding and principle so that we could kind of struggle and also determine or follow your calling into your future job as a vet. Now, a lot of times people ask me, how did I get into my internship? How was my decision-making process fourth year of vet school? How did I end up, taking the job? And those are all very good practical questions, but let's also think about the other side of the coin where we might want to be thinking about what are the wisdom and principles are there needed to be applied when we make these decisions. How do I know God is calling me to a particular job or taking my family up and moving to a particular part of the nation, changing things up? How do I know God's calling me to a particular church or all these different various facets of our lives? So there's a lot of things that we might be faced with. And so by way of introduction, there's generally 3 guidelines that the Bible is pretty clear about. So that's this next slide coming up. If God is calling you, he will generally give you 3 aspects of your life. And one of the speakers earlier hit one of my points really nicely, but I'll fill in the other 2. So if God is calling you, he will give you these 3 aspects of your life: the affinity, the ability, and the opportunity. Okay? So we'll start with the first one, affinity. So what is your desire or natural proclivity? What do you like to do? What is your passion? What do you enjoy doing? Because whatever you discern as your enjoyment might be an indication that God is calling you to that particular vocation. Like in the passage, Moses had a proclivity to free the Israelites, and that was his call, that was his passion, and that's what God had told him to do. But at the same time, some of us might want to be that Bible study leader, that guitar player at church, but you might not be gifted in doing that. So not only is it you enjoy that, but do you have God's gift and talent? So that's kind of the next step, is not only affinity, but we look at what are your abilities. I mean, for me, I really enjoyed emergency medicine, and that's why I hung on to that job when they offered that position to me at CVS. So I had that desire, that passion. And moving on to ability. So what are your gifts? Or what has God given you, and what are your natural talents? Do you enjoy being outside and working with the large animals, and that's kind of where your abilities are, or kind of want to stay more inside, do small animals, or maybe lab work, or things like that? So it's an indication that God is calling you to do a certain job or vocation based on what abilities and talents God has already gifted you with. And he's always going to equip you to do what he calls you to do. Moses was given that ability, and he was equipped, he was trained. And when he was trained as a shepherd, he didn't only have the affinity, but he had the training and the ability to do so. So it was God's providence in Moses' life to do what he was called to do, just like it is in mine, and it is in your guys' life too. So lastly, in order to discern your calling in life, he doesn't only give you the affinity, the ability, but the last point of the three is he'll give you the opportunity. Okay. So for me, the opportunity came up. Providentially, one of the other doctors had to move to the East Coast, and they offered me that job. So just three really basic, simple points as to, what might be indications to guide our thoughts in what is our calling in life. So our calling in Exodus 3, I want to discuss in kind of two realities, in other words, two theological points. Our calling in light of our salvation, okay, and our calling in light of God's name. I really appreciated what Dr. Ogilvie and some of the other speakers have been talking about, such Christ-centered talks, Christ-centered themes, very gospel-based, and I appreciate that about the themes and topics we've had, and also CVM. And it's all about, reaching out and being Christ-centered, and that's kind of what I want to hit on for the next couple moments here. So starting off with our calling in light of our salvation. During Israel's captivity and slavery, they groaned and they cried out. And it is God who responds in Exodus 2 to their groaning for help. He heard them and remembered his covenant. Exodus 3 describes God's faithfulness, and he heard them, and he wanted to remain faithful to his people and his covenant so that he could create a people for himself. And he responded to their cry for help and sends Moses to them, and that's what we read, right? What's amazing is not that he simply hears you and calls you and saves you, but he chooses to use a sinful and rebellious people, in this case Moses, to save a sinful and rebellious people. So the first and most basic calling for you in life is to the Lord. And I'll just repeat that. The first and most basic calling for you in life is to the Lord. And before you're a student, a husband, a teacher, a professor, a surgeon, whatever that is, before you discern your calling in life, your first and most fundamental calling in life is to the Lord. So you're called to be faithful to God first, and that is your calling. What we need to understand is that God saves before he sends you out into the world. He creates before he commands you to do something, and he gathers his people before he scatters them to the ends of the world. So let me just pull that on the screen so you guys have that visually. God saves before he sends, he creates before he commands his people, and then he gathers his people first before he scatters them out into the ends of the world. We often think that the Old Testament is about law and wrath and 10 commandments, and the New Testament is kind of a different God of love and grace and joy. But I want to kind of correct that simplistic understanding of the Bible. Even in the Old Testament, grace precedes law, and we see pictures of God's grace and God's love to his people even in the Old Testament. He delivers his people for himself, the Israelites, and he leads them out of slavery before he even gives them the Ten Commandments. So before he gives law, there is grace in which God saves and creates a people for himself. So what does this have to do with our calling? Well, before God tells us to do anything, he's going to make you into someone. And before he tells you to do something, he's going to make you into somebody because of these 3 points I made. Those of you that might have a little bit of philosophy knowledge might know Rene Descartes' famous quote, I think, therefore I am. But perhaps from a biblical standpoint, maybe it's actually incorrect. It maybe should be the other way around. Maybe I am, therefore I think, because God creates you and makes you somebody before you are doing something. And that's why we're human beings. We're living creatures, not just human doings of action. We're made into somebody first before we live out our actions and our imperatives. It's great, all those things that we talked about as far as doing missions work, loving people, encouraging people, having great team unity and pushing people, that's great. And just knowing where that plays in part of theology is realizing that first God saves us, and then he puts us out into the world to do all these other great things. And so God saves, so God chooses Moses to be the leader of Israel. God saves his people in Midian, and then he creates him and trains Moses and gives him the affinity, ability, and opportunity so that Moses' vocation as shepherd and prophet flows out of his first and foremost calling to be faithful and to find salvation in God. So God calls us as sinners into his kingdom and therefore calls us to serve him as our king. So what does this mean practically, I guess, for us, either students or new grads? Practically this means whatever vocation or job you take on or whatever career or major you decide upon, you must always understand that in the broadest and ultimate sense, your vocation should be understood as faithful service to the King. Whether you are of high position, low position, or a mom, a wife, a student, custodian, whatever job you have really should be understood primarily and ultimately as service to the King. Deuteronomy 8:18 states, "You shall remember the Lord your God. It is he who gives you power to get wealth." So what does this mean practically? God's the one that gives you the ability to produce wealth. And functionally or practically this means as a vet, God's using you to bring healing, to bring analysis, expertise to the animals. It means if you are married, you're a parent, that's to be a supportive spouse or to raise your children in the instruction of the Lord. So whatever calling you have, it is God who gives you that ability to produce wealth or other things that you're responsible to do based on where you are in life. Therefore, your calling and vocation ultimately is service to the Lord. And that's why Martin Luther says, whether you are the Pope or the sweet sweeper, it is the highest calling because it is the Most High God who has called you to that particular vocation. So point one, just realize that your calling should be understood in light of your salvation and calling of redemption to be faithful to the Lord. Your job and vocation and all the various facets of your life all should be done with respect to service of our King. So we'll move on to the second point here, understanding our calling in light of God's name. So what's in a name? What's so important in a name? Well, theologically, it's quite important. It's fundamental that we understand why these names are given. A name in the Bible is not just a random name or title or designation, but it's revelation. It tells you something about that person. Moses asked God, "Who shall I tell them has sent me?" And God responds, "Tell them that I am has sent you." So the name is revelatory. It reveals something about that person. I'm a big NBA basketball fan, so Even in the NBA, there's lots of nicknames. I'm a Laker fan from LA, so Phil Jackson was called the Zen Master because he practiced Zen, and Shaquille O'Neal was called Big Aristotle, or the Diesel, or Shaq Daddy, or Superman. So there's various nicknames that go along with people because it reveals something about that someone. So he's really revealing something about himself to reassure Moses, to comfort him when he says, "I am who has sent you." Moses then replies, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" I mean, Moses was old. He was just a shepherd. It wasn't a highly coveted position. And God is calling him to go to King Pharaoh to tell him, "Let my people go." I mean, how would you feel? How would you respond if that was you? I would feel very inadequate, very uncertain, very unsure. And this really shouldn't surprise us because the problem in Moses' question is because his reference, in light of sin, causes him to look to himself rather than to look to God's power. So rather than asking, "Who am I?" the question really should have been, "Who is God?" And that's why God reveals his name. And because ultimately what reassures Moses in this passage is that Moses finds his confidence in God and not in himself. And so God reveals himself through his name in that passage. So just a couple points here. Does God need us? So the truth is God may be able to do a lot of things without us, honestly. Our pastor at church jokingly but sensitively mentions that it might be easier to be a pastor if there were no people in the church. And God probably understands and resonates with that concept because with sinful people, it's not the easiest or effective or efficient way to get things done. He could do things himself, but why does he use us? Out of his grace, mercy, and love. He uses sinful people like us to get his will done. And God can get his will done much easier in some cases, in a sense, without us, but because of his grace, he uses simple people like us for his purposes. And in so doing, it brings a lot of glory to himself. He uses us to promote peace and prosperity in the world, to be lights and salts of the earth. He could do the job by himself, but in order to glorify himself, he uses to choose people like us to accomplish his will, to bring glory to his name. So our assurance to carrying out our calling comes in who God is. It comes because God reveals his name and because God says, "I am who I am." So as we were reading, Moses says to the people of Israel, "I am has sent me to you." His name is I am. It's a play on words in Hebrew, the word Yahweh, which is translated as Lord. And the name conveys that God is independent. He's always existed, unchangeable, self-sufficient. And that's why his name is simply I am. He doesn't need his people. He doesn't need us. He's self-sufficient. So what's interesting is that God gave Moses a show and tell, kind of like in grade school. God tells him, "My name is I am," but he also shows him. What is it that he shows him? It's the burning bush. So he shows him in the burning bush in verse 2. But the burning bush is not actually burning, if you remember in the passage. It's not actually consuming the bush. It's not what's needed to sustain its flame. But the fire itself is, in a sense, representing God. And the bush is representative of us, God's people. And the fire flame is not consuming the bush. So God doesn't need us to sustain himself, to sustain that fire. But the fire is independent and self-sustaining. And it has an infinite resource of fire within itself. And that is the visible representation of who God is. He says, my name is I am. I don't need you. I am perfect within myself, and I'll show you what I mean, the burning bush. So the fire doesn't need the bush to sustain its flame, but rather it dwells around the bush, surrounds the bush, and comforts the bush. So when we think about our calling, we should realize that when we understand God as the I am, it should address any fears, frustrations, anxieties we have. Because we may be insecure and struggling. We may be having a difficult time dealing with trying circumstances and sins and frustrations. But just realize that God is with you and dwells among you, just like in this passage. And he doesn't need you, but he does condescend to our level to provide comfort and reassurance. Because it's not about us, it's about God. And God reveals and says, I am calling you to be in this world. Don't be insecure because I am with you. But don't be prideful because it's about me using you. So I just want to conclude the more kind of theological portion by saying that, so the beauty of this passage is that it's ultimately pointing to who? To Christ. And realize that your calling, our calling is secure because Jesus Christ has called you to him through redemption. And our calling first has been completed by Christ, and he exemplifies what it means to follow the calling to the Father. But I don't want to leave it there and just say, let's just follow Jesus, because that's just somewhat moralistic and just religiosity, and that's not really Christianity. Sure, we do want to follow him, but we need to realize that in the gospel, in his work, in his death and resurrection, he's completed that call for us, and he's united us to himself. When God says, I will be with you, he climactically made it happen on the cross because Jesus now resides in our hearts. And this is God being our refuge. He's there for us. And this is how you will resonate with the experience of God as you determine your calling in life. So what's so glorious here is that this very name, I am, God used in Exodus, but Jesus also takes it upon himself. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the vine. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. And most climactically, when Jesus was talking to the Pharisees in John 8, he says, before Abraham was, I am. And so Jesus takes that name upon himself, showing him to be the true deity who died for our sin and resurrected for us. So I hope that in this passage and in this talk, he's shown himself through us, show that he dwells among us in his spirit and in our hearts, convicting us of our sins, making known the holiness of his Father, and enabling us by his grace to fulfill the callings of our lives as lights and salts of the earth, as we engage with the world around us. So Jesus is the I am for you and I today. So moving on to a little bit more of the more practical aspects of this talk. So how has God provided for me and has been my refuge in my transition from vet school to internship to practice? Well, he's provided me with opportunities to meet other believers. Obviously, Dr. Ogilvy has been a great mentor for me at the clinic. But I've also ran into other staff at CVS at any of our 3 locations where there's been other Christians as well. And just by mentioning things like missions trips, saying I went to church, it's just the simplest things that really opened my eyes as kind of a baby vet to say, hey, I can actually really impact people around me by saying these little minor things, and just creates tremendous conversation. And so it's been all of God's doing where he's given me that opportunity. Remember we talked about affinity ability, and now the opportunity to meet with other believers. So keep your eyes and ears open for other individuals. Even visiting externs, a lot of Western students, Davis students I've rotated through. And when you guys are in my position, keep your eyes and ears out. When there are other students coming on through, you might be running into other students that have been on a trip with CVM. So you gotta ask. CVM has lots of opportunities. Local meetings here in Southern California, local CVF groups. They're very, as you know, active in a lot of the major conferences. They'll usually have a booth there and have an evening service and then like a morning devotion here, Real Life, Real Impact, and also their annual short course in August, I believe. Other opportunities that I've had on the far left too would be with my church. They actually went down as a medical missions team to provide human medical care. And I just said, hey, would you guys like me to come along? I'll just bring some deworming medication, some vaccines, and they agreed to that. And so I brought down some vaccines and dewormers, and just very, very basic supplies. And we ended up having a really good turnout on a short weekend trip to Tijuana, and that was earlier last year. The middle panel is Vet Merge in Reynosa in August, so just several months ago, where we did work at an orphanage. Reynosa is a border town between Texas and Mexico. And the bottom where you see all the children and the animals. Dr. Beaumont is believes very heavily, very passionate about teaching children about three very important concepts. One is caring for animals, respecting them. Okay. Secondly is shelter. What do these animals need to live? And finally, so that all is one. Secondly is creator. These are God's creation. We ought to respect them. And finally is kind of tied in with the first one, but it's respecting animals in the sense that we know from studies that animal abuse is a sentinel or precursor to human domestic violence, spousal abuse, things like that. So if we can change one young Mexican child's life from beating or their spouse, I think we've made a big impact. So those are three big points that we really heavily believe about when we go on these trips with Vet Merge. And you can ask me about that, or ask Lorraine or Dr. Yale here as well. She's been on a lot of our trips. Finally, the far right side, just came back from Honduras middle of last month. We had 8 individuals, completely strangers. None of us, we weren't part of a school or anything, no vet students, just 8 strangers that came together and we just did wonderful work. And I think God was, when people say it's God's thing, well, that's it right there. I mean, where else could you take 8 random people and have such cohesiveness, such team unity, and just flow so nicely? I don't think you could. It's hard enough with 8, vet students from the same university. Imagine 8 strangers. But I think it's the bond of Christ that allowed us to be so effective and efficient and so selfless. And everyone was just so gracious and how we interacted and spoke with each other and letting each other do things that they wanted to do. So that was just a great time. Up above on the far upper right, again, not only are we healing and treating and caring animals, we also want to develop relationships with the adults and their children. So we made gospel or salvation bracelets, different colors, and we had crafts and activities for them to do as well. So definitely wanted to interact with the children as much as we could. What are some of the challenges that I faced, in internship in the first couple of years? Well, it's tough because you may be picking up your family and moving somewhere, so finding a local church that is Christ-centered, gospel-centered, observes the sacraments, things like that. And those are all important things. So finding a local church, I think, is really important. Even better would be a local church that has, small group, midweek Bible studies. That would be even better. Challenges of an internship and work schedule. If you guys were at Dr. Jamie's talk, I'm sure she talked about how demanding it is to be an intern or resident, work schedule is tough. You might be in the clinic 12 to 16 hours, and finding time to do quiet times, catching up with other brothers and sisters, that's going to be a challenge. So I don't have a good, easy answer for that, but that's some challenges that I faced, and think, what doesn't kill you is going to make you stronger. So I think those things have definitely made me stronger in the last couple of years. And then I alluded to relationships, your families, and significant others. And it can be very stressful at times. But making time to connect with other family members, I think, is really important. I mentioned quiet times and just struggles that I had as an intern and just starting out practicing. But also remembering to take time for yourself. The last talk over in the other, or 2 talks ago, talking about you got to enjoy yourself, have some humor, mess around in the right, appropriate ways. I like to say, study hard, but play hard, right? So don't, take school seriously, take the internship seriously, but remember to take time for yourself, for your emotional well-being, physical well-being, psychological, and spiritual well-being. Perhaps find an accountability partner, whether that's a mentor at your practice or someone at church or someone on the East Coast, someone that can keep up with how you're doing spiritually. All right. This is a couple of these things that I'm not qualified to talk about, but I will at least mention these things. As an intern, as a recent grad, you need to be on top of your finances. You're going to have tons of loans, probably, unless you're fortunate. And so you're going to come out with minimal salary as an intern, and just juggling those things, I think it's wise to just remember the basic principles and be a good steward of what God has given you. And that includes your finances and what God's given you through your wealth. Be diligent about paying off your loans off. You can't neglect that. Tithing, everyone has different opinions, but I think importantly is giving with a cheerful heart. I think we all know that verse and could understand that. As an intern, as a recent grad, I really taken a lot of relief positions just to support myself, get some of those loans out of the way. So those are things to consider as well. Keep your ears open to other positions. Although I am full-time at CVS, they give me free reign to do whatever I want on my outside time. So that means doing a GP shift here or there. Perfect. I can do that. And I think that's one important thing to consider. Again, I'm not by no means a financial expert, but I wanted to at least bring up those couple points. Sharing about your faith at work, I kind of mentioned that, through just daily interaction with your coworkers, you're going to be able to find that opportunity. And if you don't, it'll come. Okay? I think we've had many talks here that have mentioned through your actions, through your silent deeds, you're a silent witness, and you're a walking Bible. You're a walking Jesus Christ, walking around. So just be prayerful and be patient. I know that opportunity will come, as it has for me at our practice. Last year at CSU, Real Life, Real Impact, Dr. Siemens mentioned how he prays for every patient, he prays at every euthanasia. And after that talk, it was on a Friday or Saturday, I came back, I did a shift, I think, Sunday night, and I was thinking about what Dr. Siemens said that weekend. And I was really challenged because I said, hey, that might be something I can incorporate, is prayer with my clients. So it's Sunday night, I'm about to leave, half an hour left, I think, and a euthanasia comes in. I've been battling and struggling with this all weekend. Am I going to do this? Can I do this? What words am I going to use if I do this? How am I going to ask the owner? Do I just do it? So this patient comes in, needs to be euthanized for a justifiable reason. And I was just thinking, I know that God is with me, and I know that God gave me that message from Dr. Siemens a couple days ago, and I do want to use that. And so we prayed. I asked the owner, do I have permission? May I pray for you? I know this is a difficult time, and can we do that? And sure enough, she said, yeah. And I remember that Dr. Siemens says that he offers prayers to every client, at euthanasia. He probably has been practicing over 30, 40 years is my guess. And he says he can count on one hand how many times a client has declined prayer. I've only been doing this for about a year, and I can say for me it's about half a hand so far. And I work at a busy emergency clinic that has quite a bit of euthanasia. So I think it's something to consider. It might not be for everybody, but it's something that I've definitely taken. And every owner witness euthanasia, I will offer prayer. And some of you guys might be asking, how do I actually do that? So, I mean, basically, I'll just walk you through an example just to be practical. So after Fluffy's been euthanized, I'll just say, hey, I'm really sorry for your loss, and I'll just come up to them, and then I'll just say, there's just something I like to offer for all the clients, and some owners are comfortable with it, and some owners are not, but I like to just say a prayer for you and your family. And more often than not, they say, yes, go ahead. But also provide them an out, so it's not uncomfortable. Right after I say, I'll pray for you here, and then I say, I can pray for you privately at home before I go to bed tonight. So that just gives them an out, so that's a little bit more comfortable for them to say no. And like I said, generally speaking, I've had very positive responses. I've had one owner join me in prayer afterwards, not knowingly. She just hopped on in. I had an owner say, oh, hold on, wait, before you pray, can I also pray? I'm like, sure. So I'll open and you close. Other owners that say, hey, thank you, brother, I'm a Christian as well, so I appreciate you praying for me. So those are all opportunities, and especially working in emergency, you hear about their other problems, not just about Fluffy, but about Mrs. Jones's husband who just died, Mrs. Jones's dad who just got diagnosed with cancer, who just lost their house, who is bankrupt. These are all things that come up prior to euthanasia. My mind is fixated on those 4 or 5 things that they mentioned because that's going in my prayer no matter what. Yeah, I'm going to pray for comfort and peace, and thank you for their compassion for Fluffy through these many years, and may they be grateful for the time. But I'm also going to fixate my mind and ears on what they tell me about their family, because I think that's a way to plant the seed. Okay. I think we're coming towards the end here. Guys familiar with this author or this book? He's a surgeon in in San Diego County. He's a neurosurgeon, and he talks about praying with his patients, and it's a wonderful text. And basically, the gist of it is he went from being a Christian who thought and struggled about praying for his clients to for months and years to almost praying for several clients for months, and then finally getting to the point where him, his staff, his anesthesiologist all participated with him as he was praying for his clients. The other thing, so that's one big part of this book, and the other part is when he prayed for his clients, he not only prayed for healing, but he also prayed physical healing, but he also prayed for spiritual healing in the sense that he would ask them, do you have any unrepentant sin? Is there anyone you need to forgive? Is there any resentment, anger, rage, bitterness in your life? And over and over again, there's times where he says, yeah, there was in that patient, and MRs couldn't figure out why this person had a headache. CT scans couldn't find out why this person had a headache. Examinations couldn't find out. But once he prayed for him, that alleviated all that stress and burden and guilt and anxiety and frustration that these individuals' migraines disappeared. So it's a book worth checking out. I don't read many books, and I read that in like 3 days, so it was really great. So Gray Matter by David Levy. Joel Osteen was on Dr. Oz's show. Realize that Dr. Oz and probably Dr. And Osteen are both a little bit controversial, but there is a clip. If you just Google Oz, Dr. Oz and Osteen, he talks a little bit about prayer, so if that's something you're interested in. And that's my 2 little kids. Any questions or comments? I think we're about 4 minutes. Okie doke.
How is the staff in your facility taking in your praying for people?
That's a good question. That actually brings up another point. For the most part, they're fine with it. They're open to it. They've seen thank you cards saying, Dr. Fang, thank you for praying for my dog. I prayed with a staff who had to euthanize their dog. So generally, I will do that in a private setting rather than out in the treatment area. Unless it's really secluded, then I probably still would. But I haven't had anyone say I'm offended or anything like that. I'm not going to ask someone to participate. But if they want to be present, that's fine. So if I know another staff is religious or spiritual or doesn't have to be a Christian, I still want to include them if they're comfortable with it. You know.
My experience is that by the time you get to the point of euthanasia or something like that, you already know the people. You know where they're coming from. You know things about them, and you know whether you can say, "Would you like me to pray for you?" And I don't think I've ever had anybody turn me down because I generally know the people at that point. Mm-hmm. Most of my staff members are not Christian, but they know that I am, and they know that but we keep it private. The windows, the blinds are down, and I take time and never rush that time.
Yeah.
But it almost always comes back in the card too, or somehow.
Yeah.
It almost always be a positive, but you don't, you be proper about it and not pushy.
No.
And most people believe in prayer, even if they're not walking the Christian faith.
Yeah.
Even if they don't believe in God, it's funny, they still appreciate prayer.
Right.
You can touch somebody with it.
Yeah. And as Dr. Ogilvie had in his talk yesterday, I think, or maybe it was today, I think it's like 1 in 2 human patients desire prayer, or is it 2 in 3? It's like 50 to 75% based on studies. So you're exactly right. They do desire prayer.
I think it's really fun to see Dr. Fang last year take that lead and work at it. When he shared with us that he did that, it just made us all bold in our walk. Just think about all parts of life where you have opportunity and you take opportunity.
I remember that, Dr. Fuzz. I emailed you right away. Immediately, you and Dr. Stevens emailed you right away. So, all right, thank you guys for your attention. Appreciate it. All right, well, they're going.